Deep in the shadowed folds of the Appalachian Mountains, where the ancient ridges swallowed secrets like fog devours the dawn, stood a weathered cabin that time itself seemed to have forgotten. The air hung heavy there, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the wind whispered through the pines like ghosts sharing forbidden tales. In that forsaken hollow lived the Harlan siblings, Eliza and Cora, twins bound by a bond as twisted as the gnarled roots underfoot, and their younger brother, Jonah, a boy whose wide eyes held the weight of unspoken horrors. Eliza, with her sharp features and hair like raven feathers, moved with a predatory grace, her voice a low murmur that could soothe or slice in equal measure. Cora, softer in form but no less fierce, mirrored her sister's every glance, their laughter echoing in unison, a sound that chilled more than it warmed. Jonah, barely into his teens, trailed behind them like a shadow, his frame slight and his words few, as if the mountains had already claimed his spirit. It started innocently enough, or so the old-timers in the nearest hollow would later murmur over flickering lanterns. The sisters doted on their brother, they said, protective in the way only kin could be in these wild parts. But beneath the veil of familial devotion lurked something darker, a depravity that festered in the isolation. Nights when the moon hung low and bloated, the cabin's windows glowed with an unnatural light, and faint cries drifted on the breeze, cries that no animal could make. Jonah remembered the first time it crossed into something irreparable. The rain hammered the tin roof like accusatory fingers, and the sisters called him to the dim parlor, their eyes gleaming with a hunger he couldn't name. "It's just us now," Eliza had whispered, her hand cold on his shoulder. "Mother and father are gone to the earth, but we'll keep the family close. Closer than blood." Cora nodded, her smile a sliver of moonlight, as they drew him into their circle, the fire crackling like bones breaking. What followed in those hidden hours would haunt the hollow for generations, a tale of siblings twisted by the mountain's malevolent whisper, where love curdled into torment and innocence was devoured whole. But on that night, as the storm raged on, Jonah could only feel the creeping dread settle in his bones, knowing that escape was as distant as the stars piercing the endless black sky. The cabin crouched at the end of a washed-out logging trace that no map had bothered to name for 3 generations. Hemlock and rhododendron pressed so close that even at noon the light arrived bruised and reluctant, filtered through layers of wet leaves until it felt more like dusk than day. Fog clung to the hollow the way a fever clings to skin. It never truly lifted, only thinned enough for a person to remember there was such a thing as a horizon. When the wind moved, it carried the smell of iron-rich dirt, sour creek water, and something older like the inside of a grave that had forgotten to stay closed. 3 chimneys of fieldstone jutted from the roof, but only one ever smoked. The other 2 had surrendered to moss and lichen years ago, their hearths cold since the parents vanished into the ridges one winter and never came back down. Folks down in the valley said the mountain took them. Folks up in the hollow didn't say anything at all. Inside those leaning walls lived what was left of the Harlan blood, Eliza and Cora, 19 years old and mirror-sharp, and Jonah, 13 going on ghost. The twins moved through the rooms like matched blades. Their footfalls landed at the same instant, their breaths rose and fell together, and when they turned their heads the motion was one motion split between 2 bodies. Their hair was the same shade of crowing black, worn long and straight, never braided, never bound, so that it framed their pale faces like spilled ink. People who had seen them, mail carriers, a traveling preacher once, a game warden who got too curious, always remembered the eyes first. Pale grey ringed with soot black, the color of creek stones after a flood. They looked at you like they had already decided where to bury what was left. Jonah was smaller, all elbows and shoulder blades, the kind of thin that comes from growing too fast on too little. His hair had once been the same dark as his sister's, but months of neglect had turned it dull and brittle. He kept it shoved under an old watch cap even indoors, as though hiding the color might hide the kinship. His own eyes were different, hazel shot through with green, the only visible proof their mother had ever touched the family at all. He spoke rarely now, and when he did his voice cracked like thin ice, uncertain whether it was allowed to be heard. From the porch you could stand all day and never see another roofline, another curl of smoke, another living soul. The nearest neighbor was 6 ridgelines away, and the trail to their place had been reclaimed by laurel slicks thick enough to swallow a grown man whole. The hollow belonged to the Harlans now, and the Harlans belonged to the hollow. The mountains had a way of keeping what they wanted. They always had. It began the way rot begins, quietly, beneath the surface, where no one thinks to look until the floorboards give. At first the sisters' control wore the mask of tenderness. They rose before Jonah each morning and laid his clothes across the chair exactly as their mother once had, the flannel shirt buttoned to the throat, the trousers folded so the crease ran sharp as a blade. If he reached for a different shirt, Eliza's fingers would close around his wrist, gentle but immovable. "This one keeps the chill out," she'd say, voice soft as creek silk. Cora would nod behind her, already smoothing the chosen shirt across his shoulders before he could protest. By the time he understood he had a choice, the choice had been taken. They decided when he ate and what. The garden yielded enough potatoes, beans, a few runt apples from a tree gone half-wild, but the sisters served his plate last and lightest. They watched him chew, heads tilted at the same angle, until he swallowed the last bite. If he tried to sneak food later, the pantry latch was suddenly stiff, the jar lids impossible without two strong hands turning in opposite directions at once. Hunger became a language only they could speak fluently. School ended the year their parents disappeared. The county bus still rumbled down the valley road twice a day, but the sisters met it at the gate with polite, identical smiles and told the driver Jonah had taken sick. The lie was repeated so often it calcified into truth. Letters from the truant officer arrived in a mailbox they never checked. After a while the letters stopped. They trimmed his world the way you prune a tree you never intend to let bear fruit. They took the radio first, static hurts your ears, baby boy, then the batteries from his flashlight, then the matches he once used to light signal fires on the ridge when he dreamed someone might see. They spoke of the outside in hushed tones, the way people speak of war zones, distant, dangerous, full of strangers who would hurt a child left alone. Every story ended the same. Only here, with us, are you safe. When Jonah tried to walk the trace alone, one sister was always already waiting at the bend, leaning against a laurel as if she'd been standing there since creation. No anger, no shouting, just the slow tilt of the head and the quiet question, "Where were you planning to go without us?" The path back to the cabin felt longer each time, the hemlocks leaning closer, until the idea of leaving shrank to the size of a pebble he could roll under his tongue and swallow. Isolation settled over the hollow like fresh snow, soft, blinding, absolute. The storm came down the ridge like something hunted and furious, wind screaming through the gaps in the logs until the whole cabin shuddered on its stone piers. Rain lashed the tin roof in sheets, each drop a hammer blow, and the single kerosene lamp swung on its hook, painting the parlor walls with sick, swaying shadows. Eliza shut the door against the gale and slid the bolt with a sound like a bone snapping. Cora was already kneeling by the hearth, feeding the fire-split pine that hissed and spat blue sparks. Steam rose from their soaked dresses and curled around their faces, making them look half-dissolved. Jonah stood in the doorway to the kitchen, dripping, arms wrapped around himself, unsure whether he was allowed to move farther in. "Come sit, little brother," Eliza said, voice pitched low under the roar of the storm. The words sounded warm, almost loving, but they landed on Jonah's skin like frost. They had arranged the chairs in a tight triangle around the hearth, closer than usual, knees almost touching. Between the chairs lay the old rag rug their mother had hooked the winter Jonah was born, once bright reds and blues, now faded to the color of dried blood. Cora patted the empty seat. "We're going to play a game tonight. A family game. The kind only the three of us can play now that Mama and Daddy are sleeping under the hill." Jonah's stomach folded in on itself. He had heard them whispering about the game for weeks, late at night when they thought he was asleep, their voices threading together like briars. He took one step back and felt the wall meet his shoulders. There was nowhere else to go. Eliza rose in a single fluid motion and took his hand. Her palm was colder than the rain outside. "It's just pretend," she crooned, drawing him forward. "Like when we were little and played house. Only better. Only true." They sat him between them. Cora reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out a length of clothesline rope, soft from many washings. The lamp flame guttered, throwing their shadows tall and thin across the ceiling beams, and Jonah saw the shadows had too many arms. "Close your eyes," Cora whispered, breath warm against his ear. "It starts with trusting your sisters." The first loop of rope went around his wrists, loose enough that he almost believed it was still a game. Then Eliza began to speak, low and rhythmic, words he didn't know but felt in his marrow, words that tasted like rust and grave dirt. The fire popped, sending up a gust of sparks that died before they reached the ceiling. Outside, thunder rolled down the hollow like something enormous turning over in its sleep. When the rope tightened, Jonah understood the game had never been pretend at all. Uncle Reuben came up the trace on the first clear day in a month, riding a mule the color of creek mud and leading another loaded with salt, coffee, and the kind of pity that smells like store-bought tobacco. He was their mother's brother, the only kin still breathing who remembered the way to the cabin, and he had not laid eyes on the children since the funeral. Jonah heard the bray of the mule while he was splitting kindling behind the smokehouse. The axe slipped in his grip, the blade rang against a knot and sent a jolt up his arms. For one bright, impossible second he thought of running straight down the path, throwing himself at Reuben's boots, screaming everything. The bruises under his shirt throbbed like they knew what he was considering. Eliza was there before he took 3 steps, appearing from the shadows of the laurel as if the mountain had exhaled her. She did not grab him, she simply stood in his path, head tilted, smiling the small, patient smile she used when he forgot to say grace. Cora stepped out behind her a heartbeat later, mirror calm, holding the forgotten axe he had dropped. The two of them framed the trail like gateposts carved from bone. Reuben dismounted in the yard, boots squelching in the mud, and called Jonah's name with the rough affection of a man who had once bounced the boy on his knee. Jonah opened his mouth, tasted iron where he had bitten his tongue raw, and felt Eliza's fingers settle lightly on the back of his neck, thumb resting against the pulse that hammered there. "Lord, boy, you've shot up," Reuben said, squinting. "Skinny, though. They feedin' you enough up here?" Jonah tried. He truly did. The words clawed up his throat, "Help me, they hurt me, they won't let me leave," but what came out was a croak that sounded like a lie even to him. Eliza's grip tightened, just enough to remind him how easily a neck can break. "He's been sickly," Cora said, stepping forward, voice honey over broken glass. "Fits at night. Talks to people who ain't there. We been keeping him close so he don't wander off in one of 'em and fall in the creek." Reuben frowned, uncertain, the way men do when children look too pale and women speak too smoothly. His gaze drifted to the fresh welts peeking above Jonah's collar. "Those look new." "Fell out the loft," Eliza answered before Jonah could breathe. "Chasin' a dream. You know how sleepwalkers bruise." Jonah felt the lie settle over the yard like a shroud. Reuben shifted his weight, uneasy, but mountain courtesy is a heavy thing, and blood loyalty heavier still. By the time the coffee was poured and the salt unloaded, the moment had curdled. When Reuben finally swung back onto his mule, promising to return with the preacher and maybe a doctor, the sisters stood on the porch waving identical, gentle waves. Jonah watched the mule disappear around the bend, swallowed by green darker than any night. Behind him, Eliza's voice floated soft as moth wings. "You almost made a mistake just now, baby boy." Cora closed the door, slid the bolt, and the hollow went quiet again, as though it had never been disturbed at all. The cabin kept its memories in the walls the way old oaks keep fire scars. When the wind came down certain chimneys just right, it sounded like voices arguing in rooms that no longer existed. Jonah had grown up hearing those echoes and thinking every family carried them. Only lately had he begun to understand that some echoes were invitations. On nights when the sisters thought him asleep, they went to the keeping room behind the cold hearth, the one with the door that never quite closed. He would press his eye to the crack and watch them kneel on the puncheon floor, skirts pooled like spilled ink, heads bowed over something he could not see. They spoke in turns, sentences braided so tightly that one voice seemed to flow from 2 throats. Sometimes they used English, sometimes something older that tasted of iron and pine pitch. The air in the keeping room grew thick, sweet-rotten, the way the hollow smelled after the first hard frost when every hidden thing begins to decay at once. Later, when they came to check on him, their pupils were wide and black, swallowing the gray, and their skin carried a faint heat, as though they had stood too close to something burning that cast no light. They would stroke his hair with fingers that smelled of soil and candle smoke and tell him stories, never the same one twice, about the first Harlan who bargained with the mountain. He learned the bargain in pieces. A woman named Mourning Harlan, widowed young, left with 7 mouths and winter coming on like judgment. She went to the highest ridge at the dark of the moon and cut her palm with her dead husband's skinning knife. She let the blood drip onto a flat stone that already had older, darker stains. In exchange for enough game to last till spring, she offered what the mountain wanted most: the slow unraveling of her own bloodline, season after season, grief after grief, until the ridge itself was fat with it. The game came, fat bucks walking into the yard like tame dogs, but every child born to the hollow afterward carried a shadow behind the eyes. The sisters believed they were the fulfillment of that promise, the generation chosen to pour the richest offering yet. They spoke of it with pride, the way other girls might speak of marriage quilts or dowry chests. "Our turn to feed what keeps us," Cora whispered once, tracing the thin blue veins on Jonah's inner wrist. "The mountain's hungry, baby boy. It likes its meat young and close related." Some nights Jonah woke to find them standing over his cot, heads touching, murmuring the old words until the timbers creaked in answer. In the hearth a fire would be burning that gave off no warmth, only a greenish glow that made their faces look carved from tallow. And always, just before they left him, Eliza would lean close and breathe against his ear the same promise Morning Harlan was said to have made: "What's given willing keeps the bargain sweet." The walls listened. The mountain waited. The sisters discovered early that fear is a sharper tool than any blade, and they honed it the way their granddaddy once honed a scythe: slow, deliberate strokes that left no room for dullness. They began with the small terrors Jonah had carried since childhood. The dark behind the smokehouse where he once swore a panther watched him with yellow eyes. The root cellar whose door slammed shut on windy days and took 3 grown men to pry open again. The sound of something walking the roof ridge at night, claws ticking across the tin like slow rain. Each fear they gathered, polished, and set back into his mind brighter and heavier than before. Eliza would wait until he was almost asleep, then whisper from the doorway that she had seen their mother standing at the foot of his cot, mouth sewn shut with black thread, trying to warn him of something. Cora would laugh the next morning and say Eliza dreamed it, but she would leave a single black horsehair on his pillow anyway. After a while Jonah could not tell which sister lied and which told truth. The uncertainty itself became the torment. They taught him new fears too. They showed him how loud a human voice can be when there is no one else for miles to hear it die. They proved that skin parts easier than he ever imagined, that blood cools quickly on a puncheon floor, that some stains drink themselves so deep into pine they look like knots in the wood. They discovered he was afraid of being buried alive and accommodated him with a pine box in the barn, lid weighted with rocks, just large enough for a boy to curl inside if he pulled his knees to his chest. They left him there for one full turning of the stars the first time, longer the next. They used his body against him like a map of weaknesses. A fingernail driven slow beneath another nail until the scream came out soundless. Breath held against his face while fingers pinched his nose shut, counting heartbeats aloud. The cold iron of the old branding ring from the mule harness heated cherry red in the coals and brought close enough to blister without quite touching, close enough that the smell of his own singed hair filled the room. Each new lesson ended the same way, their mouths at his ear, promising worse if he ever tried to leave, promising mercy if he stayed sweet and still. At night he lay rigid under the quilt their mother had pieced from feedsack cotton, listening for the soft pad of their bare feet on the boards. Some evenings they came together, some evenings only one, but always they brought the dark with them, folding it around him until the difference between being awake and dreaming dissolved like mist at morning. His screams thinned to whimpers, his whimpers to silence. The mountain drank it all, and the sisters smiled in their sleep, cheeks flushed with borrowed warmth. Sheriff Emmett Race had been walking the ridges for 32 years and thought he had seen every shade of wrong the mountains could grow. 2 hikers gone missing in the same summer, though, was enough to drag him up the old Harlan trace even when the county budget screamed no. He left his cruiser at the washed-out bridge and took the trail on foot, shotgun slung easy but loaded, thermos of coffee sloshing against his hip. The fog that day hung low and deliberate, swallowing sound the way a cat swallows a songbird. By the time the cabin appeared, grey boards silvered with lichen, windows blind with dust, Emmett's boots were soaked through and his knees were reminding him he was closer to 60 than 50. He smelled wood smoke before he saw the chimney, thin and blue, rising straight up into the wet air like a signal no one had asked for. He stepped into the yard and the dogs should have barked. There were none. Only silence so complete he could hear the fog settling on the tin roof. The front door stood open a handspan, a slice of deeper dark inside. Somewhere deeper in the hollow a crow gave one rusty scream and shut up fast, as if scolded. Emmett's hand rested on the walnut grip of his revolver when the twins appeared in the doorway together, framed like a picture someone had hung crooked. They wore identical dresses the color of creek clay, hair loose and shining with damp. Their faces were clean, almost luminous, but the sheriff felt the day go colder by 10 degrees. "Afternoon, girls," he said, touching the brim of his hat out of habit more than courtesy. "Your Uncle Reuben down in Bear Wallow said I ought to check on you. Been a while since anyone laid eyes." Eliza tilted her head. Cora mirrored the motion a heartbeat later. When they smiled, it was with the same small lift at the left corner of the mouth, like they shared one expression and took turns wearing it. "We're managing," Eliza answered, voice soft enough that Emmett had to lean forward to catch it. "Mountain takes care of its own." He smelled something underneath the wood smoke then, sweet rot, copperbright, the scent that clings to a deer carcass 3 days after the crows have finished. It was coming from inside the cabin, faint but unmistakable. His stomach turned the slow, practiced roll of a man who has smelled it before. "And your brother?" he asked. "Jonah, ain't it? Be good to see the boys all right." The twins stepped aside in perfect unison, opening the doorway wider. Beyond them the parlor lay in shadow, the hearth glowing dull red like a dying eye. Emmett took one step across the threshold and felt the house breathe around him, slow and heavy, tasting the air the way a snake tastes with its tongue. From the dark at the back of the room came the faintest scrape, bare feet on puncheon, or chains too light to clink. The sheriff's hand tightened on the revolver, and the fog outside pressed closer, as though the mountain itself had leaned in to listen. The night the sheriff left, Jonah understood the walls had ears and the mountain had teeth. He waited until the lamp was trimmed low and the sisters lay in their bed behind the curtain, breathing slow and even, the way predators breathe when they know the prey is still inside the trap. Then he moved. He had hidden a shard of green bottle glass beneath his mattress for weeks, working it against the iron bed frame whenever they left him alone long enough to bleed quietly. The edge was duller than hope but sharp enough. He sawed at the rawhide cord they used now instead of rope, softer on the skin, harder to break, until his wrists were slick and the cord parted with a wet pop. Pain flared bright, but pain was an old neighbor. He welcomed it the way a drowning man welcomes the first gulp of air. The floorboards knew his weight, but he had learned which ones forgave. He ghosted past the sisters' curtain, past the hearth where the coals still nursed a faint red heartbeat, and eased the front door open just wide enough for a boy shaped like a knife blade. Cold rain slapped his face, washed the blood from his arms in thin pink rivers. He ran. The trace was a black ribbon under blacker trees. Branches clawed at him like they had bets on how far he would get. His bare feet found every sharp stone, every root slick with moss, but the pain kept him awake, kept him moving. Behind him the cabin was a single yellow eye watching from the dark. He plunged off the path into the laurel hells where no trail had ever been cut, where the growth was so thick a man had to crawl on his belly and pray. He crawled. Hours or minutes, time had come unmoored, until his lungs burned and the rain turned to sleet that stung like birdshot. Then came the low, lilting call that was not quite a voice. 2 notes, rising, falling, the sound the sisters made when they were pleased with him. It floated through the trees from every direction at once. He stumbled into a sinkhole hidden under leaves and fell hard, ribs cracking against stone. When he dragged himself up, they were there, Eliza on the left, Cora on the right, hair plastered to their skulls, dresses clinging like wet burial shrouds. Moonlight broke through a tear in the clouds and painted them silver and terrible. "Little rabbit," Eliza crooned, soft as a lullaby. "You left the warren." They did not run. They walked, unhurried, certain. Jonah tried to scream and found his throat full of blood and rain. The mountain itself seemed to tilt, funneling him back toward their open arms. When they caught him, their hands were gentle, almost loving, as they dragged him home through the mud, whispering apologies for the punishment he had forced them to give. Behind them, the laurel closed like a mouth that had never opened. They carried him back through the downpour like a broken doll, one sister under each arm, his toes carving twin furrows in the mud. The cabin door shut behind them with the soft finality of a coffin lid. They did not speak while they stripped the soaked clothes from his body, The only sound was the rain on the roof and the wet slap of fabric hitting the floor. Then they took him to the keeping room. The cold hearth had been cleared. In its place lay the flat stone their ancestor morning bled upon, dragged in from the ridge years ago and hidden beneath loose boards. It was blacker than any stone had a right to be, swallowing lamplight the way a well swallows a scream. Around it they had drawn a circle in white wood ash mixed with something darker that still glistened. Jonah's knees buckled when he saw it, but the sisters held him upright between them, patient as undertakers. Eliza knelt and pressed her palm to the center of the stone. Where her skin touched, the blackness rippled outward in slow rings, like a pond remembering it was once a mouth. Cora began to speak, not to Jonah, not to her sister, but downward, into the stone itself, using the old tongue that tasted of rust and pine needles. The words were soft, almost tender, the way a mother murmurs to a child who will not stop crying. The air thickened until breathing felt like swallowing mud. The lamp flame turned the color of old bruises. Jonah felt the stone drink the heat from the room, felt it tug at something behind his ribs the way a hooked fish feels the line go taut. A pressure built inside his skull, sweet and sickening, like the moment before fainting. Then he saw it. Not with his eyes, but with the raw place the sisters had worn open in him. A shape crouched beneath the stone, vast and patient, older than the ridge itself. It had no edges, only hunger. It wore the hollow's fog like a cloak and the mountain's weight like a crown. And it was starved. Morning Harlan's bargain had kept it drowsing for generations, fed just enough sorrow to keep it quiet. But sorrow thins over time, grows polite. What it craved now was richer, terror sharp as new whiskey, pain bright as struck flint, the slow exquisite rot of love turned inside out. The sisters were its acolytes, its beloved daughters, chosen because their devotion tasted sweetest when it fed on their own blood. Every bruise they laid on Jonah, every night they broke him open, had been an offering pressed straight into the stone. The thing beneath purred, a sound felt in the marrow rather than heard, and the circle of ash flared white-hot for one heartbeat. Jonah understood then that escape had never been possible. The mountain was not a prison. It was a stomach, and the Harlans had always been its food. The sisters smiled at him across the stone, eyes shining with something brighter than madness, and the lamplight guttered lower, as though even fire feared what came next. The knowledge hit Jonah like a second birth, sudden, bloody, impossible to push back inside. The thing under the stone needed their pain, but it needed their willingness more. Every lash, every humiliation, every tear the sisters wrung from him had been flavored with their own fierce joy in the giving. They believed themselves chosen, exalted, the perfect vessels. That belief was the final spice. Jonah hung between them now, wrists rebound with the same soft rawhide, the stone cold against his bare back. The entity pressed upward, greedy, tasting the banquet it had waited generations to devour whole. But in the raw hollow the sisters had carved inside him there was room for something new, a cold, bright clarity sharper than any bottle glass shard. He let his body go slack, the way they liked, let his head loll as though the fight had finally leaked out of him. Eliza leaned close to kiss the salt from his cheek, murmuring endearments in the old tongue. Cora's fingers traced the fresh welts across his ribs with something perilously close to reverence. They were so certain of his surrender that they loosened the circle just enough to savor it. Jonah began to speak. Not their language. Their mother's. The soft, lilting prayers she had whispered over scraped knees and nightmares when he was small, the ones the sisters had forbidden years ago as weakness. He spoke them now loud enough for the stone to hear, loud enough for the mountain to remember it had once been prayed against. The words were clumsy in his cracked mouth, but they were his, and they were refusal. The entity flinched. The sisters felt it first, a sudden absence, like stepping into a warm room and finding the fire gone out. Eliza's hand jerked away from his skin as though burned. Cora's eyes widened, the grey irises shrinking to pinpricks. The stone's hungry tugging faltered, confused by the taste of something it had not been offered in 100 years, a Harlan saying no. Jonah kept speaking. He told the thing beneath the stone about every sunrise he had been forbidden to watch, every bird call stolen from his ears, every night he had curled small to keep the dark from finding new places to cut. He told it in his mother's words, in his own cracked voice, until the prayers turned into something rawer, an inventory of every hurt, recited not as tribute but as indictment. The circle of ash began to smoke. The stone cracked with a sound like winter breaking a tree in half. The sisters screamed in perfect unison, clawing at their own faces as though the pain they had always given away was suddenly pouring back into them tenfold. The mountain shuddered, a long, slow groan rising through the roots and timbers, and for one impossible moment Jonah felt the vast hunger reverse, felt it choke on the bitter refusal it had never been fed before. He sagged forward, rawhide cutting new grooves into his wrists, and smiled with broken teeth while the cabin filled with a sound too deep for human throats and the lamp finally, gratefully, went out.